wanna get married.
Welcome back to The Place of Places, a chapter-by-chapter analysis of William Saroyan's 1972 memoir, Places Where I've Done Time. Chapter 15 describes the house in Millneck, Long Island, 1947. We're about 25% of the way through the book by now, so we can get a feeling for his tone and emotions associated with different places and times in his life. So far, his childhood years are filled with more nostalgia and positive words, a generally pleasant trip down memory lane to get into the heart of his most formative years. As we travel into his middle age, into his successful career, we get a decidedly more negative tone, especially in the 1940s and 50s, when he was in a struggling marriage. But these rough years are usually sandwiched between better years in the book and happier chapters, to keep the book moving along through its 68 episodes. In the 1940s, he had grudgingly served in the army, was far from his family, and felt alienated in the high society world of his wife, Carol, and her mother, Roisin. He did not feel comfortable around people in his own industry, the agents and critics of New York and Hollywood. This was all phony to him, and he resorted to drinking heavily to get through it. Of course, by now he had also had his 2 children to think about, which complicated his feelings further. In this rented house in Millneck, where they stayed for a winter, he's feeling completely outplayed by his wife and her mother, who arranged to stay there and have parties and appear to have money, when Saroyan tells us that they were broke at that time. The chapter is oozing with resentment. He tended to call Carol the little lady in a disgusted way, not as a term of endearment. It has historically served as a condescending and common diminutive to refer to a wife or child. And although Saroyan loved her freshness when they met, a fantasy of her didn't hold up during their marriage. Though she had presented herself as naive and innocent when they met, and she was 17, his all-American wife seemingly turned out to be obsessed with status and money, and of course, by the time he was writing this, he was apparently still bitter that she kept her true ethnicity from him for years. Millneck was colonized by the Dutch and English in the 17th century and used as a farmland for a couple hundred years. When industrialization made many millionaires in New York during the Gilded Age of the 1920s, the super wealthy built estates on Long Island, which they called their summer homes. The Hamptons is a well-known example of such a place. Saroyan tells us that summertime was called the season, and it was when the wealthy returned to their estates to have parties and mingle. This era is most famously illustrated in The Great Gatsby, which takes place in the Hamptons in the summer. But the Saroyans didn't own a summer estate. They were renting this mansion during the winter, which he tells us was very expensive to maintain, paying a staff and enormous heating bills. Still, this was something that Carol wanted. From the beginning of his relationship with Carol, Roisin was there managing her daughter's life. It was Roisin who William negotiated with in order to visit with Carol at the start. Saroyan hints that Roisin married a much older man for his wealth, and seems to have facilitated the same for her daughter, though it turns out that William often didn't have wealth. And in this chapter, he believes that they all knew the marriage was coming to an end by 1947, and that Roisin and Carol were trying to make the most out of it, while they could, including tying them to his wealth forever through his children. Of course, it was his greatest wish to have children with Carol early on, even impregnating her before marriage to make sure she could conceive. But the marriage was failing, and tensions and emotions were high for William, who was disappointed and overwhelmed with the loss of control over his life in the 1940s. Though he was still a successful writer, the drinking and the gambling debts sucked up all of his earnings. Fame and fortune were the enemy of Saroyan. Though he may have wanted that as a poor kid in Fresno, the reality of it disgusted him. His on and off years in Hollywood were some of his worst, and he describes Roisin and Carol as acting like his agents in high society, and not just literary agents, but worse, Hollywood agents. At one point in his book Obituaries, he tells us that agents are contemptible, both pimps and whores, and the world insists on having them abundantly. So, comparing Roisin and Carol to agents was really quite serious to him. His years in New York were more enjoyable because the theater was more to his liking than the film industry. Still, it all felt false to him, like he was being used and that his life was being lived for him. In I Used to Believe I Had Forever, Now I'm Not So Sure, he prefaces the story The Turk Street Gamblers with a small description of what gambling meant to him. That he never wanted to take money away from anybody who needed money. I wanted to take it away from the establishment, the specialists, the rich, the con men, the criminals, the cheaters, and the economic system itself. He railed against the kind of world in which crooks become millionaires while kids get killed at war games made me want to get rich without working. This was written a few years before Places Where I've Done Time, and both illustrate how he was feeling in the late 1940s when he was frustrated by Carol's obsession with wealth and questioning his own values, which led to more destructive gambling. Still, he did have his own visitors to Millneck, including his cousins Ross and Chesley and Artie Shaw, and it was within reach of New York, where he met with James Cagney and struck a deal that allowed Cagney to adapt The Time of Your Life into a film, finally netting Saroyan a good chunk of money that winter. In the early 1950s, he wrote The Laughing Matter and Rock Vagram, both about failed marriages and the explosion of the fantasy of a perfect or even tolerable marriage and family life. Because he wrote so prolifically and published quickly, his stories often matched up with his current mood, with not a lot of lag time between the writing and the publishing. In this way, though they are fiction, there is always the element of the tell-all diary in much of his writing, what biographer Lee Lawrence called the shadow play of his fiction. At the end of 6 painful months in Millneck, William and Carol took the family back to San Francisco, where he was once again much happier and she much more miserable. Let's put this on the Saroyan map and move on.